Well, good afternoon and happy Sabbath to everyone here, and welcome to everyone far and wide tuning in on the webcast. Now, I'd like you to imagine what this world would be like if everyone worshipped the true God and no other gods, if everyone honoured their parents, if no one killed anyone else, if no one stole anything, if no one lied and everyone told the truth, and if everyone was faithful to his or her husband or wife. Now, crime rates would virtually drop to nearly zero. Our nations could do away with prisons and jails, and there would be no need for locks, keys, and standing armies. Countless billions of dollars poured into defence could be diverted into more positive things to help society. Society would be a happy and safe place to live. Now, that's the kind of world that we would have if everyone obeyed the Ten Commandments. Now, certain more liberal theologians in mainstream Christianity would have us believe that the Ten Commandments are some kind of burden, that they're negative, and that you're just being legalistic if you try to insist on people keeping them today. Now, that little exercise of how much better this world would be if everyone kept them should instinctively tell you that something is wrong with the view that the Ten Commandments are some kind of negative burden. In fact, the Apostle John very directly stated that God's commandments are not burdensome. In fact, John tells us that keeping them is how we actually express the love of God. Now, today I'll be starting a series exploring each of the Ten Commandments, which form the bedrock of law, not just in the Pentateuch or first 5 books of the Bible, but the whole of the Bible. Now, before we explore each of the commandments one by one in future sermonettes, I'd like to cover some background information to the Ten Commandments to help us to more fully appreciate these amazing laws that God has given us. Now, Herbert W. Armstrong wrote the following in his excellent booklet, Why Were You Born? He wrote, "Actually, there exist overall only two basic ways of life, two very divergent philosophies. They travel in opposite directions. I state them very simply. One is the way of give, the other the way of get. More specifically, one is the God-centered way of love toward God and love toward neighbour. The opposite is the self-centered way of vanity, lust and greed." Now, few realise this fact. The give way is actually an invisible yet inexorable spiritual law in active motion. It is summarised in principle by the Ten Commandments. It is a law as real, as inflexibly relentless as the law of gravity. It governs and regulates all human relationships. End of quote. Now, our United Church of God booklet on the Ten Commandments makes this comment on the need for the way of love to be clearly defined by specific laws by God, which explain what true love looks like in action. Our booklet states, "Most people will acknowledge that love, or at least some degree of respect, is essential for personal relationships. A great deal of caution is in order as we consider the definitions of love. Some are so vague they excuse almost any type of behaviour. At times, love is merely a code word to encourage the acceptance of unconventional, destructive patterns of conduct." End of quote. Now, the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, verses 9 and 10 has this to say about the connection between love and the Ten Commandments. "For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbour, therefore love is the fulfilment of the law." Now, God does not give us the liberty to behave any way that we please. Now, James 2 verse 12 describes God's law as a law of liberty. Now, this liberty is not freedom to indulge our selfish desires, but freedom from sin and its painful consequences. Now, sin is defined as the transgressing or breaking of the law in 1 John 3, verse 4. Now, if there was no law in existence, then there could be no sin. One cannot sin if there is no law to transgress. Now, Paul said in Romans 7, verse 7, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. Now, the law's purpose is simply to tell us what sin is. It is not to save us. Now, we are saved from our past sins by accepting Christ's sacrifice on our behalf to pay for those sins. Repentance means to turn around and strive to be in harmony with God's law. Now, when we again break that law and commit new sins, giving in to the weakness we all have from being human, we have to, on an ongoing basis, seek the covering of Christ's blood for any new sins in order to maintain our relationship with God. Now, this is what it means to live under grace. Now, when asked what the greatest commandment was, Jesus answered in Matthew 22 by saying, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now, this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Now, this is quoted from Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, where it is then followed by instructions to diligently teach our children the laws that God gave to us. Now, Jesus then went on to quote the second, which is to love our neighbour as ourselves. And this is quoted from Luke 19, verse 18, which speaks about not taking vengeance. Now, the way that Jesus added in the extra commandment about loving our neighbour as ourselves, Jesus here seemed to emphasise how to love God and to love our neighbour are inextricably linked together. Now, when we list the Ten Commandments, we see that the first four relate to our relationship with God and could be summed up by the command to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, while the last six relate to our relationship with others, and as Paul said, are summed up by the command to love our neighbour as ourselves. Now, of the Ten Commandments, 8 of them begin with thou shalt not. And this has led to the idea that the Ten Commandments are negative and restrictive. Now, why do 8 of them begin with thou shalt not? Well, you have to think about it in terms of how a parent gradually teaches a child how to behave and live a moral life. Now, because of the limited comprehension of an infant, a parent has to be very specific, and more often than not, they have to tell them not to touch something or not to do something, because infants do whatever they feel like and whatever comes naturally until they can be trained with enough self-discipline. Now, as the child grows, the instructions from the parent are still mostly specific actions, but there's more of a balance between positive directions and negative ones. Now, as the child gets older, still, the parent explains more of why they are asked to do things and not to do certain actions. The parent teaches the child more about the principles of why things are right and wrong. Now, the more they grasp those principles of why they're right and wrong, the more the directions from the parents move from specific actions to principles and attitudes. Now, the way that God teaches us about his way of life in the Bible is much the same. We, like the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, are like spiritual infants when we first start to learn about God's way of life. The Ten Commandments are mostly specific actions where God tells us not to do certain things. The Ten Commandments warn us against the most important actions that can harm us and harm other people. Now, the statutes and the judgments, again, mostly deal with specific actions rather than principles. And there's more of a balance between positive actions and negative ones. Now, as the people of Israel did not have God's Spirit and were spiritually immature, God had to be very specific and tell them what they could and could not do. Now, when we get to the New Testament, most of the new teaching introduced about God's way of life focuses on attitudes like the fruits of the Spirit and the principles behind the laws of God. Now, I'm pretty hopeless at art. Now, this drawing here is probably my finest piece of artwork that I've ever done, showing the tree of life, which I've illustrated by having two major branches labelled as the two great commands of love to God and love to neighbour, with further branches off that labelled as each of the 10 commandments. Now, growing off the tree are the fruits of the Spirit, including the 9 mentioned in Galatians 5 and other attitudes touched on elsewhere in the Bible. Now, the 10 Commandments give the broadest specific examples of how to obey God and show love to Him and our neighbours. Now, the statutes found in Exodus through to Deuteronomy go further and expand on the 10 Commandments. Now, life is complex, and so God in His love gave Israel further specific detail as to how to love Him and others through the statutes and a selection of judgments. Now, one of my favourite books in my book collection is Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Law. Now, in discussing many of the statutes, he groups them into chapters covering each of the 10 Commandments. Now, as I cover each of the commandments in this series, I'll briefly list some of the statutes that relate to each of those commandments. Now, statutes are secondary laws that are made by lawmakers. Now, judgments, on the other hand, refer to judicial decisions made by a judge, for example, God. Now, judgments can be punishments for breaking the law, but they can be also rulings based upon the principles behind existing laws to come up with how to best apply those laws in areas where matters are unclear about what is the best thing to do. Now, some laws or judgments may be temporary in nature. Now, the Apostle Paul in Hebrews 9 spoke of laws such as sacrifices, food and drink offerings, and washings, which were temporary. Now, the holy days that God gave to Israel are not included in that listing. Now, the holy days that God gave to Israel, for at least 3 of those festivals that he gave in Leviticus 23, God states that they are a statute forever in all your generations. Now, Israel was a civic nation and could administer national laws with judges rendering sentences and carrying out justice. Now, we do not have that today in the church. Now, we are a congregation, but since we're not a civil government, only those laws which don't require a civil government and justice courts apply today. Now, a common mainstream Christian view of the Old Testament laws, including the 10 Commandments, is that with the end of the Old Covenant, after the death of Jesus, that the Old Testament laws are done away with, as they didn't exist until they were given at Mount Sinai. Now, this idea is easily disproven in the Bible. Now, we are told in Genesis 26, verse 5, that Abraham kept the statutes, the commandments, and the laws of the Eternal. Now, how could Abraham keep something that was not yet given? Now, while additional statutes no doubt were given at Mount Sinai, there was already a sizable body of law that Abraham was familiar with, including the 10 Commandments. Now, in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve disobeyed their only parent and broke the 5th commandment. Now, they also broke the 10th commandment by lusting after the forbidden fruit, and they broke the 8th commandment by stealing what wasn't theirs. Now, God later told Cain that sin was lying at his door in Genesis 4, verse 7, but still murdered his brother Abel, therefore breaking the 6th commandment. Now, in repelling the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, Joseph referred to a proposed adultery as a sin against God in Genesis 39 and verse 9. Now, God created the Sabbath day by resting on the 7th day of creation week, and he later tested the Israelites whether they would keep that Sabbath or not when he provided them with manna in Exodus 16, and this happens several chapters before they get to Mount Sinai. Now, the traditional location for Mount Sinai is Jebel Musa in the south of the Sinai Peninsula. However, the Bible indicates that Mount Sinai was in the land of Midian. Now, the land of Midian is almost universally accepted to be in northwest South Saudi Arabia, not on the Sinai Peninsula. Now, the mountain in the land of Midian with the strongest claim to being the true Mount Sinai is Jabal el-Makla. Now, what's interesting is that Jabal el-Makla means mountain of the quarry, because there is a small quarry where white marble was quarried. And so it's highly possible that this very highly favoured stone may well have been the tablets that God used for carving the Ten Commandments onto. Now, God had just brought them out of bondage in Egypt. Is it logical that God would then give them a law that would again put them back into bondage? I don't think so. Now, according to Hebrew tradition, all nations heard the roaring of the law told in Exodus 20. Now, according to the Babylonian Talmud, it says these words, talking about the Ten Commandments, were not heard by Israel alone, but by the inhabitants of all the earth. The divine voice divided itself into the 70 tongues of men so that all may understand it. Now, according to Hebrew tradition, the Ten Commandments were also given on the day of Pentecost. Now, when the Holy Spirit was given to the church on that same festival of Pentecost, almost 1,500 years later, a similar phenomenon occurred as that described in the Babylonian Talmud, where the wonderful works of God were heard by everyone in their own language. So that concludes our look into the background of the Ten Commandments. Now, in this introduction to the Ten Commandments, we've seen how the Ten Commandments warn us against the most important actions that can harm us and harm other people. Now, despite their negative wording, they are a blessing, protecting us against the dangers of sin. We've seen that the purpose of the law, including the Ten Commandments, is to tell us what sin is. And the Ten Commandments also show us what actions demonstrate what love looks like towards God and towards our fellow man. We've also seen how the Ten Commandments form the bedrock of the greater body of laws that God gave to his people. And finally, we've seen how the Ten Commandments existed before they were formally reiterated and written on the tablets that God gave to Moses at Mount Sinai. In my next message, we'll explore the first commandment: you shall have no other gods apart from the true God.